Legends claim that a werewolf's heart shatters only once. It is a violent, echoing rupture deep within the soul, a pain so absolute it leaves behind nothing but ash. Elara felt hers tear to shreds the exact second her fated mate looked into her eyes and publicly chose another. Rejection, however, was merely a brutal prologue. Discarded like spoiled meat, she was forcibly shipped across the freezing northern mountains to pay a blood debt to a monstrous crippled sovereign rumored to be half dead. Her former pack thought they were sending a fragile, defenseless Omega to a cold grave. They had no idea they had just handed a dying Lycan King the most terrifying weapon in the realm. The great hall of the Silver Crescent pack was suffocatingly warm. It was filled with the rich scent of roasted venison, heavy spiced wine, and the overpowering musk of hundreds of dominant wolves pressing shoulder to shoulder. It was supposed to be the night of the mating ceremony, the sacred evening when the new Alpha would officially claim his destined Luna before the eyes of the moon goddess. Elara stood at the base of the grand wooden dais, her small hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together against her simple silk gown. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack hierarchy, but fate had played a cruel, twisted joke on them all by making her the true fated mate of Thorn, the newly crowned Alpha. For 3 agonizing years, they had kept it a secret. For 3 years, in the quiet dark of his chambers, Thorn had promised her that when he took the title, he would defy tradition and claim her proudly. Instead, Thorn stood atop the dais, his broad shoulders draped in ceremonial winter furs, tightly holding the hand of Elara's worst tormentor, Celine, a high-ranking beta from a wealthy neighboring territory, wearing a smug, victorious smile. The pack requires absolute strength. Thorn's voice boomed, echoing off the ancient vaulted ceilings. He did not even look at Elara. His gaze was fixed somewhere above the crowd, cold and detached. In these dark and uncertain times, an Alpha cannot be tethered to weakness. A pack cannot survive with a fragile bleeding Luna at its helm. I, Thorn of the Silver Crescent, Alpha of the East, reject you, Elara. I sever the bond. You are no mate of mine. The words were not just a social execution, they were a physical blow. A blinding, searing agony ripped through Elara's chest. She gasped, all the air violently expelled from her lungs as she fell to her knees on the cold stone floor. The spiritual tether between them, a golden thread woven by the goddess herself, was brutally snapped. The metallic tang of blood filled her mouth as she choked on her own sob. The massive crowd fell dead silent. No one moved to help her. Whispers erupted like dry brush catching fire. An Omega? A weakling? Of course he rejected her. She is nothing. Elara tasted copper. She forced her heavy, tear-blurred eyes to look up desperately, hoping to see a single flash of regret in Thorn's face. There was none. There was only cold, calculating ambition. Before Elara could even process the total devastation of her soul, the heavy oak doors of the great hall were thrown violently open. The winter wind howled into the room, bringing with it the harsh scent of ozone ice and the distinct, terrifying musk of unfamiliar, lethal wolves. A contingent of soldiers marched in. Their armor was forged of dark, heavy steel, bearing the crest of the Blackwood Kingdom, a roaring wolf pierced by a silver broadsword. The murmurs in the hall died instantly. Even Thorn stiffened his alpha aura, faltering under the oppressive weight entering his territory. At the head of the contingent was Silas, a towering Lycan warrior with a face carved from granite and eyes like chips of flint. He bypassed the lower tables entirely, ignoring the low growls of the Silver Crescent guards, and marched directly to the base of the dais, Alphathorn. Silas spoke his deep voice, entirely lacking any of the customary respect owed to a pack leader. I come on behalf of King Kaelen of Blackwood. The tribute for the winter solstice is past due. Our treaty stipulated grain, forged steel, and a bride of noble pack standing to serve the royal court. Thorn's jaw tightened. The treaty with the Blackwood King was the only thing keeping his pack from being slaughtered by the northern invaders. But sending a bride to King Kaelen was universally considered a death sentence. 3 months ago, King Kaelen had been ambushed by shadow assassins. He had miraculously survived, but the rumors that trickled down from the mountains painted a gruesome, horrifying picture. The Lycan King had been poisoned with dark silver. His legs were completely paralyzed. His face was horribly scarred. He was trapped in a heavy iron wheelchair, a brooding, volatile monster whose fits of mindless rage were so terrifying that servants fled the castle in the dead of night, never to return. He was a crippled king whose own kingdom was slowly turning against him. "We have prepared the grain and the steel," Thorn said smoothly, rapidly recovering his composure. He looked down at the floor, his eyes landing on the crumpled, weeping form of Elara. A cruel, opportunistic light suddenly flickered in his eyes. "And as for the royal bride, we offer a woman of pure bloodline." Elara. Gasps rippled through the entire hall. Celine smirked behind her jeweled goblet of wine. "An Omega," Silas sneered, looking down at Elara as if she were a rat that had scurried in from the cold. "You insult the Lycan King by offering him the pathetic runt of your litter. She is pure, and she is unbonded." Thorn lied effortlessly, deliberately omitting the fact that he had just shattered her soul into 1,000,000 pieces. "The treaty asks for a bride. It does not specify her pack rank. Take her, or the treaty is void." Silas's eyes narrowed dangerously, but he knew he could not return to the Blackwood Fortress empty-handed. He reached down and grabbed Elara by the arm, hauling her to her feet with bone-bruising force. Elara did not fight. She did not scream. She was hollowed out, a ghost trapped in her own failing body. As they dragged her toward the heavy doors and out into the freezing, relentless rain, she looked back one last time. Thorn had already turned away, laughing warmly at something Celine had whispered in his ear. The journey to the Blackwood Fortress took 5 agonizing days. Locked inside a drafty iron-barred carriage, Elara shivered in the damp cold. The lingering toxic pain of the rejected mate bond made her physically ill. She threw up bile onto the wooden floorboards, her fever spiking dangerously high as her inner wolf whimpered in the dark recesses of her mind, curling into a tight ball of misery. Usually, a rejected Omega faded away and died from the grief within days. But deep within the agonizing void in Elara's chest, beneath the sorrow and the cold, something else began to subtly stir. A very faint, pulsing warmth. A dormant, ancient spark that outright refused to let her die. The Blackwood Fortress was a monstrous structure carved directly into the side of a jagged, unforgiving mountain. It loomed over the capital city below, like a dark storm cloud, its black stone spires piercing the overcast sky. When the carriage finally ground to a halt in the central courtyard, Elara was practically dragged out by the guards. Her thin silk dress was stained with mud and ruined her bare feet entirely numb from the frost. She was led blindly through a labyrinth of dark, freezing corridors. The air here was incredibly heavy, thick with the scent of old blood, bitter medicinal herbs, and an overwhelming, crushing aura of despair. There was absolutely no joy in this castle. The servants kept their heads bowed, scurrying against the damp stone walls like frightened mice. The royal guards looked exhausted, their eyes constantly scanning the deep shadows for unseen threats. "Clean her up," Silas barked to a small group of trembling elderly maids when they reached a lavish yet dimly lit chamber in the eastern wing. "The king will see his new tribute at sunset. Dress her in something that doesn't smell of Silver Crescent filth." For the first time in 5 days, Elara was treated with something faintly resembling gentleness. The maids bathed her in steaming water, scrubbing the dirt and dried sweat from her pale, trembling skin. They brushed her long, dark, cascading hair until it shone in the dim candlelight, and dressed her in a heavy, rich velvet gown of deep sapphire. Yet despite the luxury of her clothes, Elara felt exactly like a lamb being dressed for the slaughter. When the heavy oak doors of the king's solar swung open, the stench of rotting flesh and bitter wolfsbane hit her like a physical wall. The room was cavernous, lit only by a massive roaring hearth that cast dancing demonic shadows against the heavy tapestries. "Leave us." The voice was a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated violently in Elara's bones. It didn't sound like a man. It sounded like a dying, cornered beast. The guards immediately withdrew, slamming the heavy iron-wrought doors shut and leaving Elara entirely alone with the monster of Blackwood. She stepped forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the center of the room, facing the massive fire, sat a heavy, imposing iron wheelchair. "Come closer, Omega. Let me smell the stench of Thorn's betrayal," the voice ordered, dripping with lethal malice. Elara forced her trembling legs to move. As she rounded the chair, she finally laid eyes on King Kaelen. He was a mountain of a man, his frame incredibly broad and heavily muscled, wrapped casually in a thick black wool tunic and dark northern furs. But the ruin that had been inflicted upon him was horrific to behold. The right side of his face was marred by thick, jagged burn scars that warped his strong jaw and blinded his right eye, leaving a milky dead orb. His legs, heavily wrapped in blood-stained bandages, lay completely motionless on the metal footrests of his chair. But it was his remaining good eye, a piercing storm-gray iris, that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. It was filled with such raw, unadulterated agony and a blinding, suffocating fury that she felt an involuntary whimper escape her lips. Kaelen sneered his scarred lip, curling up to reveal elongated, lethal canines. "An Omega?" He scoffed the word, dripping with venomous disgust. "Thorn sends me an Omega to breed my royal heirs, a broken, rejected toy." The first 2 weeks at Blackwood Fortress were a brutal, unforgiving lesson in isolation. True to his word, King Kaelen ignored her existence entirely. After their disastrous first meeting in his solar, Elara was given a massive drafty suite in the forgotten East Wing, but she was essentially a ghost haunting the stone corridors. The royal court treated her with barely concealed contempt. To the lords and ladies of the North, she was nothing more than a pathetic symbol of their king's failing power, a rejected broken Omega bride, sent as a cruel joke to a dying sovereign. Lord Vance Kaelen's aristocratic uncle, who effectively controlled the castle's domestic affairs, made it a specific point to humiliate her at every turn. He assigned Elara the smallest rations of food, the coldest bathwater, and sneered at her whenever they crossed paths in the dimly lit hallways. "Do not unpack everything, little Omega," Lord Vance whispered venomously one afternoon as she passed the grand staircase. "The dark silver is already eating the king's spine. When he expires, you will be thrown to the rogue wolves in the lower valleys. We have no use for Silver Crescent trash." But Elara did not weep. The tears she had shed for Thorn had completely dried up. Instead, she found a strange, quiet solace in the heavy gloom of the fortress. Away from the hyper-competitive, abusive atmosphere of her former pack, she finally had time to breathe. More importantly, she had time to listen to the strange new rhythm echoing inside her own body. It started as a faint tingling in her fingertips. Sometimes, when she touched a wilted, freezing flower in the castle's neglected courtyard, the dead petals would momentarily perk up, flushing with vibrant color before returning to their frozen state. She felt an ancient energy thrumming in her veins, a golden liquid heat that seemed to sing whenever she was walking near the heavily guarded doors of the king's quarters. She did not understand it. Omegas were submissive caretakers, completely void of the raw, crushing strength of alphas or the tactical, sharp minds of betas. They certainly did not possess magic. Magic was a dangerous myth, eradicated centuries ago during the Great Purge, when the Spirit Weaver's wolves, who could manipulate life force and heal the darkest of curses, were hunted to extinction by fearful, power-hungry alphas. The terrifying revelation of what she truly was came on the night of the full moon. For a normal werewolf, the full moon is a sacred time of immense power, a night where the inner beast demands to be let out to run under the stars. But for Kaelen, it was a night of unspeakable, mind-shattering torture. The dark silver poison lurking deep within his bloodstream reacted violently to the intense lunar pull, boiling his blood and burning him from the inside out. Elara woke in the dead of night to a sound that completely chilled her blood. It was a scream. A guttural, tearing, inhuman sound of a monstrous alpha being slowly flayed alive. It echoed fiercely through the empty stone corridors, vibrating through the thick floorboards and rattling the glass in her windows. She threw off her thin furs and ran out of her chambers without a second thought. The hallways were completely deserted. The torches flickered wildly in the draft. She quickly realized that the guards and servants had deliberately abandoned the royal wing. They were too terrified of the king's mindless, agonizing wrath to stay at their posts. Elara ran toward the king's chambers, her bare feet slapping loudly against the freezing stone. She pushed the heavy iron-wrought doors open and froze in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The massive royal sola looked like a war zone. Heavy oak furniture was smashed into jagged kindling. Ancient, priceless tapestries were torn down and shredded. In the center of the absolute wreckage lay King Kaelen. He had dragged himself out of his heavy iron wheelchair. His massive, heavily muscled upper body trembled violently as his claws gouged deep, brutal trenches into the solid stone floor. Thick black veins pulsed violently up his muscular neck and across his scarred face, glowing with a sickly, toxic silver light. He was hyperventilating his broad chest, heaving frantically. His single storm-gray eye was rolled back in his head, completely lost to the blistering, suffocating agony. "Kaelen!" Elara shouted, completely forgetting his royal title and the danger he posed. She rushed forward, falling to her bare knees beside him. The heat radiating off his massive body was immense, like sitting next to an open furnace. The sickening smell of burning flesh and highly concentrated dark magic choked the air, making her eyes water. "Get out!" Kaelen choked out. His voice distorted into a demonic, multi-layered growl that carried the crushing weight of a dying alpha aura. He tried to blindly shove her away to protect her from his thrashing, lethal limbs, but his massive arms finally gave out. He collapsed onto the cold stone, panting raggedly. "It's burning, goddess. It's tearing me apart," he rasped, his voice breaking in a way that shattered Elara's heart. He wasn't a monster. He was a proud, powerful king, trapped in a cage of his own decaying body, entirely abandoned by the people who were sworn to protect him. Just like her. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than the stone walls around them, Elara reached out. As her trembling hands hovered over his broad, heaving chest, the dormant golden warmth deep within her core suddenly erupted. It did not just tingle this time. It roared like a magnificent awakened beast. A brilliant, ethereal golden light flooded her palms, instantly cutting through the dark shadows of the wrecked chamber. Kaelen gasped, his remaining eye snapping wide open in absolute shock as the radiant glow reflected in his pupil. Elara pressed her glowing hands directly against his bare chest, right over his violently beating heart. The exact moment her skin made contact with his, a massive shockwave of pure kinetic energy blasted through the room. The force of it rattled the heavy stained glass windows and instantly blew out the roaring hearth fire. The dark silver poison visibly recoiled beneath his skin as if it were terrified. The glowing black toxic veins instantly stopped spreading, halting their lethal march toward his heart. Elara closed her eyes tightly, gasping as she felt the sheer crushing magnitude of his pain enter her own mind. But she did not pull away. She absorbed the agony, letting her strange ancient power weave a thick protective barrier around his vital organs. She pushed the golden light deeper into his flesh, soothing the ravaged nerves, actively silencing the dark magic that had been eating him alive for months. And then, beneath the harsh stench of blood and bitter wolfsbane, an entirely new scent hit her senses. It was overwhelming, intoxicating. The rich, deep scent of fresh rain, dark mountain pine and wild heather. It wrapped around her soul like a warm blanket, instantly soothing the ragged edges where thorn had severed her past bond. It was the undeniable, earth-shattering scent of a true fated mate. For 10 excruciating minutes, the ruined solar was bathed completely in the blinding, magnificent golden light of a true spirit weaver. When the light finally faded back into her skin, Elara slumped forward entirely exhausted. She was panting, heavily cold sweat dripping from her forehead as she rested her cheek against Kaelen's broad, solid chest. Beneath her, Kaelen was perfectly still. The terrifying, unnatural heat was entirely gone. The black glowing veins had receded, disappearing deep beneath the blood-stained bandages on his paralyzed legs. He was breathing deeply, evenly, without the ragged, desperate hitch of constant pain. Slowly, the terrifying Lycan King lifted a massive, trembling hand. He did not push her away. He did not roar. Instead, his thick, calloused fingers tentatively brushed against her dark, cascading hair, his touch impossibly gentle for a man of his size. The crushing alpha aura in the room had vanished, replaced by a fierce, heavy, and wildly possessive protective instinct. "What are you?" Kaelen whispered into the silent dark room. His voice was completely devoid of anger, replaced only by a profound trembling awe as he stared at the Omega he had sworn to ignore. For the next month, the heavily guarded royal bedchamber became a warm, secret sanctuary built on dangerous truths. By day, Blackwood Fortress remained a miserable monument of gloom. King Kaelen played his part flawlessly. He would slump heavily in his iron wheelchair, his skin deliberately powdered with pale ash by Elara to mimic the graying pallor of imminent death. He would cough violently during the brief council meetings, feigning absolute exhaustion to dismiss his treacherous lords early. But by night, when the heavy oak doors were firmly bolted shut and the massive hearth fire roared, the fragile facade dropped entirely. Their nightly healing sessions became an intimate, profound ritual. Elara would kneel gently before his chair, pressing her warm hands against his broad chest and his paralyzed legs. The ancient golden magic of the White Queen would flow from her palms, slowly but steadily burning away the toxic dark silver that had woven itself into his nervous system. It was grueling, agonizing work. Elara would often collapse completely drained and shivering from the sheer, magical exertion, and every single night the terrifying Alpha King would gently gather her up. As the lethal strength miraculously returned to his massive upper body, and soon after his legs, he would carry her to his own massive fur-lined bed. He would hold her carefully until dawn, his colossal frame radiating a protective grounding heat. He would bury his scarred face in her dark hair, breathing in the intoxicating scent of wild mountain heather and sweet rain. They had not formally spoken of the fated mate bond, but the air between them crackled with an undeniable gravitational pull. It was a fierce, possessive tether that made Kaelen's blood roar whenever she was near. "You are pushing yourself too hard, Elara," Kaelen rumbled one quiet evening. He was standing, actually standing. He leaned heavily against the stone mantelpiece, his powerful muscles flexing under his tunic. The jagged burn scars on his face seemed to soften only when he looked at her. "I have to," Elara murmured softly, kneeling beside the hearth as she pressed her glowing hands against his thigh. Kaelen hissed sharply, a thick muscle jumping in his square jaw, as the intense feeling of pins and needles rushed frantically through the limb. "The dark poison is entrenched deep in your spine. If I stop now, it will fester and spread again." "Let it!" he growled fiercely. He reached down his large hands, gripping her waist, and effortlessly lifting her to her feet until she was flush against his solid chest. He lifted her chin, forcing her to look directly into his intense, stormy gray eye. "I will not let this magic kill you to save me, Elara. I refuse to lose you, not when I have just found you." The absolute sincerity in his deep voice made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. Thorn had treated her like a burden, an embarrassing stain on his pack's reputation that needed to be hidden in the shadows. Kaelen, a monstrous sovereign feared by entire kingdoms, treated her as if she were the most precious vital force in the entire world. But the peaceful quiet of their secret world was about to shatter violently. 2 days later, Elara was returning from the damp apothecary in the lower levels of the fortress. She carried a woven basket of dried willow bark and bitter lavender, specifically chosen to mask the lingering scent of her golden magic. As she passed a shadowy recessed alcove near the castle's war room, she heard hushed, urgent voices. She froze instinctively. pressing her small frame against the freezing stone wall and holding her breath. He should be dead by now. The sharp aristocratic voice hissed in the dark. Elara recognized it instantly. It was Lord Vance Kaelen's uncle. I increased the dosage of the dark silver in his wine, just as you instructed, my lord, a second voice whispered frantically. It was the head steward. But he drinks less and less, and that wretched Silver Crescent Omega, she hardly leaves his side. She insists on tasting all his food before it reaches him. Then Alpha Thorn is a pathetic fool, Vance spat venomously. Elara's blood ran entirely cold at the mention of her former mate. Thorn promised me that sending a rejected broken Omega would be the final ultimate insult to break my nephew's spirit. Vance continued, his voice dripping with pure malice. An unbonded runt was supposed to push Kaelen into taking his own life, or at least leave him completely vulnerable. Instead, she guards him like a rabid hellhound. Elara pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to muffle her gasp. Thorn had not just discarded her to fulfill a simple border treaty. He had actively conspired with Lord Vance. Thorn knew about the Dark Silver assassination attempt. He was actively helping the usurper uncle steal the throne of Blackwood, and Elara was merely meant to be the collateral damage, a convenient sacrifice. "What do we do, my lord?" the steward asked, his voice shaking with terror. "The Winter Solstice Summit begins tomorrow. The Northern Alphas are already arriving. Alpha Thorn's carriage just entered the lower bailey. If Kaelen is still breathing during the banquet, he will secure the Lord's allegiance for another year." "He will not be breathing," Vance stated coldly. The chilling sound of a steel dagger being drawn from its leather sheath echoed ominously down the corridor. "If the dark poison will not finish the job quietly, I will do it myself tomorrow night. The Northern Lords respect strength. When I present them with a dead weak king, they will bow to me." "And as for the girl, dispose of her before the banquet," Vance ordered ruthlessly. "Make it look like she threw herself from the high battlements out of sheer grief. No one mourns an Omega, and Thorn certainly will not care." Elara did not wait to hear another word. She turned and fled silently down the dark corridor, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The horrifying reality of their situation crashed down upon her shoulders. They were completely surrounded by heavily armed enemies inside their own home. And tomorrow, the man who had shattered her heart was coming to watch her die. She practically threw herself against the heavy oak doors of the King's Sola, slipping inside and slamming the iron bolt shut behind her. Kaelen was sitting near the fire, casually running a whetstone down the edge of a massive lethal broadsword. He looked up, his sharp alpha instincts instantly detecting the overwhelming scent of her pure terror. He dropped the sword and stood up in a fluid, terrifyingly fast motion, clearing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "Who touched you?" Kaelen demanded. His voice dropped to a lethal demonic rumble, his eyes flashing a brilliant glowing gold in the dim light. The crushing weight of his alpha aura flooded the room, heavy enough to drop a grown warrior to his knees. "No one," Elara gasped, clutching the front of his tunic. "Kaelen, I heard them. Lord Vance and Thorn. They planned the assassination together. The poison wasn't an accident. Thorn arrived early. They are going to murder you at the Winter Summit tomorrow night, and they plan to throw me off the battlements." Silence fell over the room. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the suffocating, heavy calm right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. Kaelen did not rage. He did not smash the furniture. He simply looked down at the woman trembling in his arms, his fated mate, the woman who had dragged him back from the icy grip of death. A terrifying, lethal calm completely washed over his scarred features. He reached up his large, rough hands, gently cupping her pale face. His thumb tenderly wiped away a stray tear from her cheek. "Let them scheme, my beautiful Omega," Kaelen said softly, though his deep voice vibrated with an ancient, predatory hum that made Elara shiver. "They think they are trapping a crippled, dying wolf in a corner. They have absolutely no idea what is waiting for them in the dark." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow night at the grand banquet, you will not hide in the shadows." Kaelen promised, his grip on her waist tightening protectively. "You are not a broken toy, Elara. You are the queen of Blackwood. Tomorrow you will wear my royal colors. You will stand proudly by my side, and we will let Alphathorn see exactly what he threw away right before I tear his throat out." The Winter Solstice Summit brought a chaotic, deafening influx of foreign dignitaries, battle-hardened warriors, and arrogant pack leaders into the icy courtyard of Blackwood Fortress. Banners of rival northern territories fluttered violently in the freezing wind, but none caught the eye quite like the crimson and silver crest of the Silver Crescent Pack. Standing by the frosted window of the high royal chambers, Elara watched as Alphathorn dismounted his massive warhorse. He looked incredibly arrogant and robust, wrapped in heavy, expensive winter furs, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. Beside him was Celine, shivering slightly, but wearing a smug, victorious smirk that Elara knew all too well. "You are shaking, little wolf," Kaelen noted. He was sitting in his heavy iron wheelchair near the roaring fire, already dressed in his formal regal attire. He wore midnight black velvet dark iron armor plates across his broad chest and a heavy crown of jagged obsidian resting on his dark hair. The jagged scars on his face only added to his terrifying, lethal majesty. Elara turned away from the window, crossing her arms tightly to hide the faint trembling of her hands. "He is here. Thorn and Lord Vance are exchanging pleasantries in the lower bailey as we speak. They look so incredibly confident, Kaelen. They think they have already won." After Elara had told him of the horrific conspiracy she overheard the previous night, a terrifying, lethal calm had washed completely over the Alpha King. He had not raged. He had not broken any more furniture. He simply called for Silas, his fiercely loyal captain of the guard, and spent the night quietly moving his loyal elite forces into position. "Let them scheme and smile," Kaelen said softly, though his deep voice vibrated with a predatory, bone-rattling hum. "They are stepping blindly into a slaughterhouse. They have absolutely no idea what is waiting for them." He reached out, offering his large, heavily calloused hand. Elara stepped forward and took it. His grip was incredibly warm, entirely grounding her racing heart. The faded mate bond pulsed beautifully between them, a golden, invisible tether that chased away the lingering shadows of her past trauma. "Are you ready?" Kaelen asked, his storm-gray eye tracing the delicate lines of her face. The elderly maid, sworn to absolute secrecy by Silas, had spent hours preparing her. She no longer looked like the frail, weeping Omega dragged through the mud. Elara was breathtaking. She wore a heavy, magnificent gown of spun gold and midnight blue velvet, the royal colors of Blackwood. A delicate silver circlet rested perfectly in her dark, cascading hair. But the true transformation was in her posture. Her spine was completely straight. Her chin was held high. and her eyes, once filled with submissive terror and constant anxiety, were now calm, commanding, and piercing. "I am ready, my king," Elara whispered the ancient magic of the White Queen, humming softly beneath her skin, eager to be unchained. Down in the great hall, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The cavernous room was packed to the rafters. Dozens of powerful alpha leaders sat at the incredibly long, heavy wooden tables, murmuring aggressively among themselves. They were entirely predatory, gathered here to assess the weakness of the Blackwood King. If Kaelen showed even a fraction of the frailty rumored to plague him, these alphas would tear the kingdom apart before the winter snow melted. Lord Vance stood near the high table, acting as the gracious commanding host. He was essentially parading his assumed future power, smiling thinly at the lords and pouring generous cups of heavily spiced wine. Down at the lower tables, Alpha Thorn held court. He was boasting loudly to the neighboring pack leaders about his territory's recent expansion. He felt utterly invincible. In his toxic, narrow mind, Lord Vance would publicly take the throne tonight. The Silver Crescent Pack would immediately be elevated to royal status for their crucial role in the assassination. And the pathetic, worthless Omega he had dumped here was likely already rotting at the bottom of the frozen ravine. "It is a pity the king is too weak to join us for the opening toast." Celine sighed loudly, a false mocking pout on her painted lips. One must wonder who is truly leading the North in these dark times. Lord Vance raised his golden goblet, a dangerous, triumphant gleam in his eye. He tapped his knife against the metal, demanding absolute silence from the massive crowd. The heavy murmurs slowly died down as the alphas turned their attention to the high table. "My esteemed lords, noble alphas of the North," Vance began, his voice projecting smoothly across the hall. "We gather tonight under a heavy shadow. It is no secret that my beloved nephew, our king, has suffered a grievous tragedy. The dark magic in his veins has left him incapable. In his tragic absence, it falls to the strong to bear the crushing weight of leadership. The North cannot afford a crippled wolf at its helm." Thorn nodded aggressively from the crowd, entirely ready to back Vance's treasonous claim to the throne. "Therefore," Vance continued, puffing out his chest, "I must humbly suggest that we—" Suddenly, the massive heavy iron doors at the very top of the grand staircase groaned violently open. The horrific screeching sound of the metal hinges entirely drowned out Vance's speech. The royal herald stepped forward, slamming his heavy iron staff against the solid stone floor. The sound cracked like a whip, echoing through the cavernous hall. "All rise!" the herald roared, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "For His Royal Majesty, King Kaelen of Blackwood, and his destined fated mate, Queen Elara." The great hall went completely terrifyingly silent. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor as dozens of massive alphas scrambled to stand out of sheer instinct. Down at the lower tables, Thorn's jeweled wine goblet slipped entirely from his hand. It clattered loudly against the heavy wooden table, spilling dark red wine everywhere like a pool of fresh blood. He stared at the top of the grand staircase, his breathing completely stopping, his mind utterly paralyzed. There, gripping the handles of the king's heavy iron wheelchair, was Elara. But this was absolutely not the broken weeping girl he had banished in the freezing rain. She did not cower. She did not look at the floor. She stood at the very top of the steps, looking down at the sea of powerful werewolves with an icy, hollow indifference that cut deeper than any forged blade. She exuded an aura of completely calm, ancient power. It was not the crushing, aggressive dominance of an alpha. It was something older, something deeply woven into the very fabric of the earth and the moon. As she slowly began to push the wheelchair down the long ramp parallel to the stairs, a faint, pristine golden residue seemed to shimmer in the air around her. Lesser wolves in the massive room instinctively swallowed hard, fighting an overwhelming, irrational urge to bare their throats to her. Elara Thorn whispered, his mind violently short-circuiting. The name fell from his lips like a curse. Queen Destin, mate, no. No, that is impossible. Beside him, Celine's face had drained of all color. Her smug smirk was entirely gone, replaced by an ugly, contorted mask of jealous, sheer panic. Elara gracefully pushed Kaelen all the way to the center of the high table, stopping right beside a horrified Lord Vance. Vance's polite, aristocratic smile strained so incredibly hard, it looked like a painful grimace. He bowed hastily, but his panicked eyes darted nervously to his nephew in the chair. "Nephew," Vance said smoothly, though a drop of cold sweat rolled down his temple. We did not expect you to be strong enough to join us tonight. The castle physicians said you were entirely too frail to leave your bed, did they not?" Vance probed desperately. "Or was that simply what you hoped, Uncle?" Kaelen asked softly. Even though Kaelen spoke quietly, his deep, gravelly voice projected effortlessly through the absolutely silent, cavernous hall. Every single alpha in the room held their breath. Lord Vance stiffened his hand, twitching toward the dagger hidden beneath his velvet cloak. "I only ever wish for your absolute health, my king." "Then," Kaelen replied, a slow, terrifying, and completely lethal smile spreading across his scarred face, "you shall have your wish." What happened next would be etched into the bloody history of the Northern Territories for 1,000 years. Kaelen placed his massive scarred hands flat against the heavy iron armrests of his wheelchair. He did not struggle. He did not shake. The dark silver poison that had once gnawed at his spine was nothing but ash in his veins, eradicated entirely by the ancient magic of his fated mate. With a fluid, terrifying grace that defied his colossal size, the Alpha King of Blackwood pushed himself up. Loud collective gasps ripped through the cavernous hall. Several battle-hardened Alpha Lords actually stumbled backward in pure shock, knocking over their heavy wooden chairs. Kaelen stood at his full, towering height. He was a mountain of solid muscle and lethal intent, draped in midnight velvet and dark iron. He took a heavy, deliberate, and perfectly steady step away from the chair. He was no longer a crippled sovereign waiting to die in the shadows. He was an apex predator, fully unleashed and hungry for blood. Lord Vance's face instantly turned the color of wet ash. He backed up frantically, his polished boots slipping on the stone floor as his hand dropped toward the jeweled hilt of his sword. The overpowering scent of his sour, terrified sweat immediately flooded the dais. This is impossible." Vance stammered, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at his nephew's perfectly steady legs. The dark silver. The dosage was lethal. "You allied yourself with a traitorous cur from the Silver Crescent Pack to poison your own royal blood," Kaelen growled. His voice was a low, guttural vibration that actually rattled the silver plates on the banquet tables. "You thought to humiliate my queen, execute me in my own hall, and steal my throne." Down in the massive crowd, Thorn's eyes widened in sheer unadulterated panic. The crushing reality of his monumental stupidity finally crashed down upon him. The king was fully healed. The conspiracy was exposed. Thorn turned instinctively to flee toward the main exit, abandoning Celine without a second thought. But before he could even take 3 steps, the heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut with a deafening boom. A dozen of Kaelen's fiercely loyal elite guards, led by Silas, stepped out from the shadows of the pillars. They drew their massive broadswords in perfect unison, blocking all exits with a wall of cold, lethal steel. Kaelen turned his massive head, his piercing, storm-gray eye locking directly onto Thorn in the center of the panicked crowd. The sheer oppressive weight of the king's pure alpha aura suddenly slammed into the room. It was agonizingly heavy, a physical shockwave of absolute dominance that forced the air out of everyone's lungs. Several lesser betas and omegas were immediately forced to their knees, weeping openly under the sheer pressure of it. "Alpha Thorn," Kaelen called out. The name echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sounding exactly like a formal death sentence. "Step forward. It is time you formally greet your new queen." The silence in the great hall was absolute thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the violent crackle of the massive hearth fire and the terrified, ragged breathing of the conspirators. Thorn's legs felt like solid lead. Every single primitive instinct within his wolf screamed at him to submit to drop to his belly, bare his throat and whimper for mercy before the monstrous power radiating from the throne. But his toxic pride, the fragile ego that had led him to ruin, kept him standing. He took a hesitant, trembling step out from the crowded tables. The eyes of every single pack alpha in the north burned violently into his back. Thorn looked up at the high dais. His desperate gaze shifted from the towering, fully healed Lycan King to the magnificent woman standing right beside him. Elara. She was the Omega he had openly mocked, the woman he had cast aside into the freezing mud as worthless refuse. Now she was draped in the royal midnight blue and gold of Blackwood Fortress. Her dark hair was crowned in silver, and her pale skin literally glowed with an otherworldly, pristine vitality. She looked down at him, not with the weeping heartbreak he expected, but with an icy, absolute indifference that cut far deeper than any physical blade. She was wholly untouched by his presence. The mate bond that he had so callously severed had been replaced by something immensely more powerful. "Kneel before your Queen Thorn of the Silver Crescent," Kaelen commanded. She is a weakling," Thorn stammered blindly, his voice cracking. He looked around frantically at the other northern lords, desperately begging for support that simply wasn't there. "She is a runt, a rejected broken thing." Kaelen did not shout. He simply released the full, unbridled, crushing weight of his king's aura directly onto Thorn's shoulders. It hit the Silver Crescent Alpha like a physical avalanche of dark stone. Thorn let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His knees buckled instantly. He slammed into the hard stone floor so violently that the sickening crack of bone was clearly audible in the quiet room. He was pinned to the floor, panting heavily, entirely unable to lift his head under the sheer, suffocating dominance of the Lycan King. "You brought her to my fortress gates as a final insult," Kaelen said smoothly, walking slowly down the stone steps of the dais with the lethal, silent grace of a stalking panther. He stopped mere inches from Thorn's trembling, bowed head. "You truly thought you were discarding garbage. Instead, You blindly delivered my salvation, my destined mate, and the very key to your own absolute destruction. Beside the high table, Lord Vance finally realized the political game was entirely over. The dark silver poison had failed completely. His grand assassination plot was exposed in front of the entire northern nobility. If he surrendered now, Silas would hang him from the highest battlements for high treason before sunrise. "Guards!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria as he drew his jeweled broadsword. The steel shrieked against the scabbard, but the blade was not normal steel. It glowed with the sickening, toxic black aura of highly concentrated dark silver. The king is possessed by dark magic. He is an abomination. Slay him, and the Omega. Absolute chaos violently erupted. 24 heavily armed guards, loyal to Vance. Men who had been secretly bought with silver crescent gold, drew their weapons and charged the dais from the side corridors. The visiting Alpha Lords immediately scrambled backward, overturning heavy banquet tables to get their lunas out of the lethal crossfire. Kaelen did not even draw his sword. He didn't need to. As the first 2 traitorous guards lunged at him with spears, the Alpha King moved with a speed that entirely defied his massive, heavily muscled frame. He caught the wooden shaft of the first spear, barehanded shattered it effortlessly with a flick of his wrist, and drove the splintered, jagged end straight through the traitor's iron armor. He spun instantly, catching the second man by the throat, lifting him entirely off the ground, and throwing him into a solid stone pillar with bone-crushing force. "Protect the Queen!" Silas roared from the back of the hall, drawing his massive claymore and rallying the true royal guards into a brutal, bloody counteroffensive. Steel clashed violently against steel. The metallic ringing deafened the hall, drowning out the horrific screams of the dying. But up on the high dais, amidst the swirling chaos, Lord Vance saw a fleeting, desperate opportunity. Kaelen was distracted at the bottom of the steps, systematically tearing through the traitorous guards. Elara was momentarily left standing alone near the high table. Vance's mind was entirely fractured by terror and ambition. If he could just kill the Queen, the king would fall into a mindless, suicidal blood frenzy, and the throne could still be his. Gripping his dark silver blade with both hands, the usurper uncle sprinted across the dais, lunging straight for Elara's unprotected back. "Die, you pathetic little bitch!" Vance shrieked, driving the toxic glowing blade downward. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The heavy metallic stench of the highly concentrated dark silver poison choked the air, burning the back of Elara's throat. Lord Vance moved with the desperate wild speed of a cornered animal, his heavily jeweled dagger aimed directly at the center of her spine. Elara Kaelen's roar was a catastrophic, earth-shattering sound. It was not the battle cry of a king. It was the raw, primal scream of an alpha, watching his fated mate standing in the path of absolute death. He ripped his broadsword free from the chest of a fallen traitor, his massive muscles bunching as he tried to cross the dais. But there were too many bodies, too much broken furniture in the way. He was not going to reach her in time. Down on the floor, still violently pinned by the king's crushing aura, Alpha Thorn watched with wide, terrified eyes. A sick, twisted part of his mind expected her to scream. He expected the weak, pathetic Omega he had discarded to cower, to drop to her knees and weep as the dark blade descended. But Elara did not flinch. She did not cower. As Lord Vance lunged, his face twisted in a mask of ugly, venomous hatred, Elara simply turned to face him. She raised her bare hand. The ancient magic awakened, nurtured by the mate bond, and completely unchained, answered her silent call. A blinding, explosive wave of pure, kinetic golden light blasted outward from Elara's palms. It was not just a soothing, healing aura this time. It was a physical, devastating manifestation of life force acting as an impenetrable shield. The tremendous shockwave slammed directly into Lord Vance, hitting his chest like a solid battering ram, forged of pure sunlight. Vance was thrown violently backward through the air. He flew entirely off the high dais, crashing brutally into a heavy oak banquet table in the center of the hall. The thick wood splintered into 1,000 pieces under the sheer impact. The dark silver dagger flew from his grasp, the highly toxic blade shattering into harmless gray dust before it even touched the stone floor. The blinding golden light illuminated the entire cavernous hall, freezing every single warrior lord and traitor dead in their tracks. The brutal fighting ground to an immediate breathless halt. Massive, blood-soaked alphas dropped their weapons, shielding their sensitive eyes from the magnificent, overwhelming radiance pouring from the queen. The suffocating stench of blood and dark poison was instantly obliterated. The great hall was suddenly flooded with the incredibly rich, intoxicating scent of ozone fresh winter rain and wild mountain heather. It was the scent of the earth taking back its power. Elara stood at the edge of the dais, her chest heaving the ethereal golden magic still violently dancing across her fingertips and winding up her arms. Her dark hair floated slightly around her shoulders, completely untouched by the winter draft. Her eyes, usually a soft, warm brown, were now entirely consumed by a glowing ancient gold. She looked absolutely terrifying. She looked divine. "My king," Elara said, her voice ringing out with a strange dual resonance that echoed deep within the chest of every wolf in the room. "The traitor is yours." Before Vance could even attempt to drag his broken body out of the splintered ruins of the table, Kaelen was there. The Lycan King descended the steps of the dais in a terrifying blur of black velvet and heavy iron. He did not bother with his sword. He reached down and grabbed his uncle by the front of his heavily embroidered tunic, lifting the usurper entirely off the stone floor with a single, massive hand. Kaelen Vance choked out blood spilling over his lips. His aristocratic arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic weeping terror of a dying coward. "The poison. The Southerners manipulated me. I am your blood. I am your family." Kaelen's storm-gray eye was completely devoid of mercy. The jagged burn scars on his face seemed to pull tight as he bared his elongated, lethal canines. "You brought dark magic into my home." Kaelen's voice was a low, demonic vibration that shook the very foundation of the fortress. "You allied with cowards. You sought to slaughter my destined mate in front of my court. The penalty for high treason is not reason, uncle. It is eradication." With a sickening, definitive snap that echoed fiercely through the silent hall, Kaelen crushed Lord Vance's windpipe. He casually tossed the lifeless, broken body of the Duke onto the stone floor like a discarded rag doll. The heavy, terrified silence that followed was absolutely absolute. The surviving traitorous guardsmen, who had been bought with silver crescent coin, took one look at the colossal, fully healed Alpha King and the glowing divine queen standing above them. All at once, they dropped their weapons. The heavy clatter of steel hitting the stone echoed like a surrender bell. They fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads frantically against the cold floor, whimpering for a mercy they knew they would not receive. From the back of the terrified crowd, an old grizzled figure slowly stepped forward. It was Elder Alistair, the oldest and most revered lore-keeper of the Northern Pack Council. He was trembling violently, heavy tears streaming openly down his weathered, scarred face as he stared up at Elara. He ignored the bloodshed, ignored the dead usurper, and walked directly to the base of the grand staircase. He leaned heavily on his wooden staff, completely overwhelmed by the profound magnitude of what he had just witnessed. Slowly, agonizingly, the ancient Alpha lowered himself to his knees, bowing until his spine protested loudly. "Your Majesty?" Elder Alistair rasped his voice, cracking with intense, overwhelming emotion. "The light, the golden force, I thought it was only a myth." Kaelen stepped to the bottom of the stairs, positioning his massive body protectively between the kneeling elder and his queen. "Speak clearly, Elder. According to the forbidden texts guarded deep within the sacred moon archives." The elder wept, looking up at Elara with absolute, unquestioning reverence. The ancient bloodline of the original Spirit Weavers was thought to be completely eradicated during the Great Purge centuries ago. "We thought the goddess had abandoned us." The elder swallowed hard, his eyes wide. But the texts explicitly noted that the universe is not without a profound sense of balance. To protect the sacred magic from the endless greed of violent alphas, the gene would hide itself. It would bury itself in the most overlooked, underestimated members of the pack, the Omegas. It would lie completely dormant, passed down through generations in absolute silence, until it was violently awakened by a true mate's catastrophic, life-threatening need. He gestured with a trembling hand to the faint golden residue still glowing softly on Elara's skin. "You are not just a healer, my queen. You are the White Queen, the Sinclair anchor, the physical manifestation of the moon goddess's grace returned to the mortal realm to lead the Lycan King." Down on the floor, still trapped in the agonizing grip of Kaelen's lingering aura, Alphathorn's head snapped up. A pathetic, desperate whine forcefully escaped his throat. The White Queen, the Sinclair anchor, the most legendary, overwhelmingly powerful bloodline in all of werewolf existence, an entity capable of bringing entire empires to their knees with a single whisper. A Luna whose very presence guaranteed centuries of absolute prosperity and unbeatable strength. And he had thrown her away. He had publicly humiliated her. He had severed their fated bond because he wanted to look strong in front of a few border lords. He had discarded a living goddess because she did not look tough enough to fight in his petty, meaningless skirmishes. The crushing, suffocating weight of his monumental stupidity brought stinging, bitter bile to the back of his throat. He looked across the room. Celine, the beta he had chosen over his destiny, was currently cowering beneath a flipped table, weeping hysterically, her expensive dress soaked in spilled wine and terror. He had traded a diamond forged by the goddess for a worthless stone. Elara Thorn pleaded, his voice breaking into a wretched, pathetic sob as he began to crawl forward on his hands and knees over the shattered glass. "Elara, please." Thorn dragged himself forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp shards of shattered glass biting deeply into his palms. He left a pathetic trail of blood on the polished stone floor. his expensive winter furs dragging in spilled wine. "Elara, please." Thorn sobbed, his voice echoing in the deafening silence of the great hall. He looked up at her with red, terrified, desperate eyes. The bond. We were fated. The moon goddess meant for us to rule the Silver Crescent together. I was blind, Elara. I was manipulated by Lord Vance and Celine. I never meant to hurt you. Come back to me. You are my true mate. Kaelen took a heavy, lethal step forward, a deep, earth-shaking snarl vibrating in his massive chest. His storm-gray eye burned with absolute murderous fury. He was entirely ready to draw his broadsword and separate Thorn's head from his shoulders for daring to speak to his queen. But Elara gently raised her glowing hand, stopping the lethal Lycan King with a single calm motion. She walked slowly down the stone steps of the dais, her heavy midnight blue velvet gown sweeping gracefully over the floor. She stopped just inches from Thorn's trembling, bleeding hands. The crippling fear, the agonizing heartbreak, and the suffocating anxiety she used to feel for this man were completely gone. The gaping, painful void in her chest, where he had violently severed their bond, had been filled entirely with ancient, pristine light and the fierce, protective love of a true king. Looking down at Thorn now, Elara felt absolutely no anger. She only felt a profound, chilling pity. "We were fated, Thorn," Elara said, her voice perfectly calm, carrying effortlessly through the silent, kneeling hall. "But fate is merely a door. It is our choices that force us to walk through it. You severed our bond before your entire pack. You stood on your high dais and declared me a worthless, broken runt. You humiliated me. You broke my heart into 1,000 pieces and left me to bleed out in the freezing rain." "I was wrong," Thorn wailed, pressing his forehead directly against the cold stone floor at the tip of her royal shoes. "Have mercy on me, Elara. I beg of you." "You did not reject me because you were manipulated, Thorn." Elara continued, her tone turning to absolute unforgiving ice. "You rejected me because you are a small, weak coward who is utterly terrified of anything you cannot easily control. You saw a quiet Omega and thought you could not use me to fuel your fragile ego. You traded a sacred blessing for a crown of thorns." Elara lifted her chin, the ancient golden magic flaring brilliantly around her silver circlet. "I am not a vengeful woman," she declared, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the Sinclair anchor. "But you are a dark stain on your people, and you are no longer fit to lead anyone. By the ancient power vested in me as the true Luna of Blackwood and the White Queen of the North, I formally strip you of your alpha title." Thorn wailed in absolute soul-tearing agony, as if he had been physically stabbed in the heart. The decree of a White Queen was absolute. The invisible, heavy mantle of alpha power that he had clung to so desperately was instantaneously ripped from his spirit. His broad shoulders visibly slumped. The dominant aura he possessed vanished entirely, leaving him feeling hollow, weak, and utterly broken. "The Silver Crescent Pack will be immediately absorbed into the Royal Blackwood Army under Captain Silas's direct command," Elara announced to the kneeling Northern Lords. She looked down at the pathetic weeping man at her feet one last time. "You will leave this territory tonight, Thorn. You have no pack, no title, no wealth, and no home. You are a rogue. If you ever dare to set foot within the borders of the Blackwood Kingdom again, my king will not be nearly as merciful as I am." At a sharp nod from Kaelen Silas, and two heavily armored guards stepped forward. They hauled a screaming, thrashing thorn to his feet and dragged him violently out of the great hall. In the corner, Celine was similarly dragged away by the royal guards, her hysterical sobbing pleas echoing off the walls, until she was thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeons of the fortress to await her own trial. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their miserable fates forever. Slowly, Kaelen stepped to the center of the room. The Alpha King looked out over the sea of kneeling, terrified northern lords. Alpha Gideon, a notoriously stubborn and fierce warlord from the western ridges, was the very first to break the silence. His eyes darted from the blood pooling on the floor to the terrifying, fully healed Lycan King, and finally to the glowing divine woman standing on the dais. The undeniable scent of absolute, unquestioning submission flooded the room. Gideon dropped his head, burying his face against the cold cobblestones. Long live King Kaelen! Long live the White Queen! Like a massive tidal wave crashing over the shore, the remaining Alpha Lords followed suit. Dozens of the most powerful, arrogant werewolves in the northern territories collapsed to their bellies. They bowed so incredibly low, they practically kissed the stone, swearing absolute, unquestioning fealty to the Blackwood King and his impossibly powerful fated mate. The royal court was dismissed shortly after. The Alpha Lords shuffled out quickly, their heads bowed deeply in respect, eager to escape the overwhelming, suffocating pressure of the royal pair. Within moments, the massive ruined great hall was entirely empty, save for the crackling hearth fire and the two rulers left standing in the center of the wreckage. Kaelen turned slowly to Elara. The terrifying, blood-soaked sovereign looked down at her with a raw, desperate vulnerability that instantly melted her heart. The heavy, lethal Alpha King aura dropped completely, leaving only the fiercely devoted possessive man underneath. He reached out his massive, heavily calloused hands, gently cupping her pale face. His thick thumbs stroked her high cheekbones with a terrifyingly gentle reverence, as if she were made of the most delicate spun glass, a rejected broken omega thrown away in the freezing rain. Kaelen murmured, his deep voice dropping to a low, incredibly intimate rumble. And a crippled dying king rotting in the shadows. We make quite the terrifying pair, my beautiful Sinclair anchor. Elara smiled a genuine, breathtaking expression that brought light back to her brown eyes. She leaned her weight completely into his warm, grounding touch, wrapping her arms securely around his solid waist. You were never a crippled King Kaelen, Elara whispered softly. You were just waiting to heal, and I was never a broken thing. I am exactly where the goddess always meant for me to be. Kaelen's stormy gray eye darkened with a fierce, possessive affection. He pulled her flush against his broad chest, the rich, intoxicating scent of dark mountain pine, fresh winter rain, and sweet wild heather wrapped around them tightly like a physical blanket, sealing them off from the rest of the world. He buried his scarred face in her dark cascading hair, inhaling her scent so deeply his massive chest expanded. Then let us make it official, Kaelen whispered fiercely, his hot breath ghosting over the sensitive skin of her neck, hovering dangerously close to her mating gland. Let me claim what the goddess perfectly designed for me. Let the entire realm know that the monster of Blackwood bows to absolutely no one, except his queen. Elara tilted her head back, baring her throat in the ultimate absolute display of werewolf submission and trust. she offered her soul to him completely. "Claim me." Kaelen's eyes flashed a brilliant, predatory gold. His sharp canines elongated, and with a gentle, reverent precision, he bit down hard into the crook of her neck. The initial sharp pain was breathtakingly brief, instantly swallowed by an explosive, rushing wave of pure golden warmth and absolute, unadulterated ecstasy. As his teeth pierced her skin and his venom mixed with her blood, the true fated mate bond finally clicked perfectly into place. Their souls tethered together violently in the dark, an unbreakable, eternal fusion of the ancient Spirit Weaver magic and the raw, unyielding power of the Lycan King. From the cold ashes of brutal betrayal and cruel rejection, Elara had not only saved the man she was destined to love, but she had resurrected a dying kingdom. She had proven to the entire world that true power does not roar from a stolen throne. It heals, it protects, and it rises brilliantly from the deepest shadows when the wicked least expect it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And there you have it. The breathtaking, epic conclusion to Elara and Kaelen's story. From a broken, rejected Omega, left for dead in the freezing mud, to the legendary White Queen, who resurrected a dying Alpha King and brought an entire realm to its knees. Elara proved that true power does not come from the pack you were born into, but from the unyielding courage buried deep within your soul. Thorn learned the agonizingly hard way that discarding a quiet heart to chase false power will ultimately lead to absolute ruin, while King Kaelen found not just his lost strength, but his soul's true eternal mate in the darkest, coldest shadows of the Blackwood Fortress. If you were captivated by this intense story of ancient magic, brutal royal betrayal, and a faded romance that violently defied all the odds, please hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fantasy and werewolf romance lovers, and do not forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another epic, heart-pounding saga. What was your absolute favorite twist in Elara's awakening? Did Thorn get exactly what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next adventure.